Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to you all, from those down the road to the folks around the world. Welcome back to another Wednesday weekly video, and yet another short, quick facts video, this time on the year 1931. Now, I did one last week on the year 1921, and I will be doing a series of these over the next few weeks, so stay tuned for that. But on this note, 1931, here we go. Now, do you remember last week when I mentioned that Leon Trotsky was still a powerhouse within the Russian government, taking out anti-Bolshevik sentiment and a great revolutionary figure of 1917? Well, in 1931, he and his family had their Russian citizenships removed and spent the remaining years of his life, died in 1940 in Mexico, he spent the remaining years of his life hopping from European country to European country, writing papers and talking about fascism and the critical the problems that came with it. Not only did the Russians withdraw Trotsky's citizenship from him, but they also tightened their grip on life and influence. They banned Sergei Rachmaninoff's music from being played. Rachmaninoff was still living at this time in 1931, but he was a influential Romantic era composer, and it was claimed by the Russians that his music was too decadent for the communist way of life. Now, another thing that I mentioned last week was the slow shortening of women's hemlines, which caused great backlash among a number of individuals, leading to some states in America issuing fines and penalties against women for acting like men. But over the past couple of seasons up to 1931, the hemlines were actually growing longer again, which was then condemned by the women because they felt that this expression of their freedom was being taken away from them. Now, in May 1931, the International Colonial Exhibition opened up just outside of Paris, where dignitaries from all across the French Empire converged on Paris, or just outside of Paris, in this outdoor exhibition to spectacle and to show off the cultures that were within the French Empire, to show off to the general public about what was in the French Empire, but also springboard off of this newfound interest in tourism that was coming about in the late 1920s and early 1930s. On May the 1st, 1931, Henry Hoover, the President of America, opened up the Empire State Building in New York City. Now, you probably know that the Star-Spangled Banner is the American national anthem, and 90 years ago, that Star-Spangled Banner anthem became the official anthem for the United States. The light bulb, the gramophone, the telephone, even the first moving pictures were all just some of the 1,100 patented ideas that Thomas Edison created in his 84 years of life. Because on October the 18th, 1931, Thomas Edison sadly died at his home in New Jersey. Now, in 1931, here in the UK, a man by the name of Oswald Mosley formed the New Party, which would go on to become the British Union of Fascists in late 1932. Now, after forming this new party, the former sort of political group that Mosley was affiliated with, the Labour Party, would actually kick Mosley out of their membership, and any of Mosley's supporters within the new party were actually banned from joining the Labour Party itself. Now, in September of 1931 also, on a trip to Glasgow, Oswald Mosley was actually stoned and physically beaten up by communists in the Glasgow region. Now, we know that the fascist movement across Europe was not just a scene within Germany or Italy or Spain. We obviously saw it happening in England as well. And in Holland in 1931, a new Nazi party was being created as well. It seems that fascism was becoming the new frightening trend of the 1930s. Chicago gangster Al Capone was already public enemy number one to a lot of people's eyes, but in 1931 he was coming under increasing pressure. His arrest was ordered in February, and in the June of 1931, he and 68 of his henchmen were charged with breaching prohibition laws. But it wasn't until the October of the same year that he would actually go to prison, but on tax dodging charges. he would serve an 11-year sentence, which is the largest sentence for such tax-dodging offences. The new element of halogen was discovered in 1931, which would go on to be used in a number of different manufacturing appliances, from ovens to light bulbs. But of course, in this day and age, we don't necessarily use halogen anymore because we have more energy efficient and more cost-effective methods. Now here in the UK, we suffer from overpriced train tickets and slow, delayed trains. But this isn't exactly a new problem, because on the 8th of January 1931, there was the recommendation by the Royal Commission of Transport to create cheaper fares and faster trains. Now, in early 1931, a bill was being put through the UK Parliament about the opening of Sunday cinemas, maybe even exhibitions and public debates. Now, this was largely unheard of up until 1931, and there was a lot of critical opposition towards it because of the holiness of the Sabbath day, the day of rest. But there was the assurances by the bill makers that all of the profits from these Sunday cinemas and events, exhibitions and whatnot on a Sunday would go to charity. Rolls-Royce, which is the famous car manufacturer here in the UK, created its R engine in 1931, which would go at a whopping speed of 404 miles per hour, which was setting a new record. In flying news, the new record for how long it would take to get from the UK to Australia was set in 1931. The record time, 214 hours. It's laughable, isn't it? It seems as though that we can get to Australia now in just under 24. But back then, this was a monumental feat. And another monumental feat of flying prowess was new travel corridors and connections could be made between London and Central Africa. Now, the Pope of the time, in the early days of 1931, Pope Pius XI, called for a stemming on sexual liberation. He wanted to prohibit divorce and abortion, and he was especially critical on films and novels and newspapers for not respecting the sanctity of marriage that was so crucial to the Catholic Church. But the Pope was also very critical about political matters. He condemned communism and he called fascism anti-Christian. He was willing to distance himself from Mussolini, the leader of Italy at that time, which only came just 2 years after the state leaders of Italy and the church had finally started to get along. In retaliation to this, Mussolini actually banned two of the big Catholic organisations, the Catholic Action Organisation and the Catholic Youth Organisation. Now, Mussolini's influence didn't just stop at politics and religious oppression. You see, the government of Italy gave prizes to some of the biggest families in the country. And publicly, a famous conductor, Arturo Toscanini, was actually beaten up, had his passport removed and placed under house arrest for refusing to play the fascist anthem in Italy, Gio Venezia. But one of the better things that Mussolini did in 1931 was clamp down on mafia influence in Italy. He arrested 124 mafia members and jailed them for life. After almost a year in prison, Mahatma Gandhi was released, but asked his followers to continue with the civil disobedience movement that he had started back in 1930 with his Salt March. In the sort of February of 1931, Gandhi actually met up with the Viceroy of India, Lord Irving. And after a couple of months, Irving agreed that he would end the salt tax in return for a stoppage of all of the civil disobedience movements. But this didn't stop Gandhi from making moves towards freedom and independence within India. In the July of 1931, Gandhi arrived in London for a series of round-table conferences, multi-party conferences that were discussing how to move forward with the administration within India. There had been a previous series in 1930, early 31, finishing just as Gandhi was being released from prison. And following that first unsuccessful lot of conferences, the Tory party, or the Conservative Party, decided that they weren't going to attend this second lot. This already puts the conferences and their success rate on the back foot. It doesn't look to be going too well. But then Ramsay Macdonald, just a few days after Gandhi arrived in London, said that domestic issues on the Great Depression, the economic crisis, the run on the bank, was far more important than any international quarrels that may be going on in India or in other parts of the empire, or indeed any other parts of the world. But this didn't stop Gandhi in the least. He continued with the roundtable conferences, along with a few party members. He made pleas to the British public. In November, he met the King, which was a very it sent a great deal of messages towards the British public and towards the Indian public as well. Gandhi was in a simple loincloth, whereas the King was in full regalia. But despite the conferences, despite the pleas to the government, despite meeting the King, the roundtable conferences ended in complete and utter failure, and, well, Gandhi was forced to go home and continue his fight over back in India. Now, with the failure of the roundtable conferences in London, India returned to its non-cooperation and civil disobedience movements. In the Congress at Bengal, there were calls for a boycott on all British goods. And because a number of attacks and riots had been felt in the same region, the government of India planned to take action against so-called Bengali terrorists. And in another sort of retaliative move, the new Viceroy of India, Viscount Willingdon, said that he would no longer tolerate any non-cooperation or civil disobedience movements in the future. Now, in June of 1931, reports were coming out suggesting that the UK government was actually going to reduce how much benefits were going to be paid to the unemployed citizens of the UK, back down, decreasing it to the 1921 levels, 15 shillings for men and 12 shillings for women. Now, the UK unemployment level stood at 2.7 million people by July of 1931. But the UK government said that they were not about to decrease or do any changes to the benefits system. Now, the Great Depression was going to be swinging into the forefront of British politics in 1931. Although the British government weren't going to be bringing down the benefits system or benefit payments, they were going to be cutting the spending in public finances and increasing taxes. This plan of Ramsay Macdonald, the Labour Prime Minister, and backed by the Treasury Commission, actually shocked the entire Labour cabinet. It put the Labour Party and the trade unions, who had previously been going along in harmony politically, they were now at loggerheads with each other. There were riots in the street. There were protests against such emergency measures. There was a run on the banks. The stock exchange had to close for up to 2 days. And because of this run on the bank, the Americans and the French had to give £25 million each just to sustain this run on the bank. Britain, who had previously used this gold standard, money tied into gold per se, they abandoned this system, which plummeted the value of the pound by an expected 30%. Thankfully, a lot of other countries decided to abandon the gold standard as well. And thankfully, also, a nice gesture, if you will, the King of England, King George VI, actually took a £50,000 pay cut during this crisis. Now, with all this crisis and economic strife and backlash against such extreme measures, which some claimed were communist in style, Ramsay Macdonald was ousted as the Labour leader. Now, you can't be the Prime Minister if you aren't a leader of a political party. So Ramsay Macdonald created his own national government, his own national party, a mixture of Labour MPs, Conservative MPs, under one umbrella, in order to create a better government that would be from all different opinions to solve this economic crisis. An election was called in October 1931, and he won that election. And with that, the national government would go on to have successive prime ministers over the next, well, decade, as it stemmed the crisis economically and moved forward into the modern world. Now, Germany was going through its own economic crises at this point in 1931. In January, the unemployment level stood at 4.7 million, and by the end of February, it was up to 5 million people unemployed. So in order to help out a little bit and maybe boost the economy just a tad, Germany entered into a customs pact with its neighbour Austria. Now, the League of Nations picked up on this pact, this initial thing, and said, hold on, is that actually a legal move? After months of deliberation and discussions and hearings, and even after the Nazi members within the Reichstag building of German government demanded that Germany come out of the League of Nations, after all of that, the League decided that no, this pact is not an acceptable move. This is completely illegal. Now, not only was this customs pact illegal, the Deutschmark actually collapsed, causing the banks to close between the 13th of July and the 5th of August 1931. They still had to pay the reparations from the First World War that had been agreed in 1921. And their gold reserves were quickly running out because of this crisis. So President Henry Hoover, in a sort of act of maybe saving grace, depending on how you look at it, decided that perhaps the Germans should delay their payments of the reparations by a year, because the world economy was stagnating, and it would also ease a little bit of pressure on the German government to get back into the swing of things and then be able to repay these reparations. Furthermore, the Americans, the British and the French actually renewed a series of credits to the Germans so that they could again ease the pressure of their own economy and be able to then quickly repay back the reparations. Now, in the background of this German crisis, there was the slow and deliberate rise of the Nazi Party within German government and within German influence. In the city of Brunswick, up to 100 people died in clashes between Nazis and communists in the October. In the November, the Nazi Party actually won key elections in the Hesse region, one of the most influential and biggest regions in the German country. And by early December, there were reports coming out of Germany suggesting that the Nazis were thinking about sterilizing populations in order to create a Nordic dominance. But Hitler was a Democrat, so he so called himself. Just another lie in a series of lies that would lead to a most evil and horrifying conclusion, and horrifying scheme that the Nazi Party would create. Now finally, the whole reason why I'm doing this series, as I mentioned last week, is because 1931, as with this year, is a census year. And in 1931, the census was saying that the UK population stood at 44.8 million people, 6.85 people per square mile, which apparently was the smallest increase in population since the censuses began back in 1801. The census was telling us that people were moving to the southern regions or the southern counties of England, as up to 14 separate towns and different areas were doubling in population size, whereas some of the northern counties were actually seeing a decrease by up to half. Well, I hope that you have enjoyed this video and you've sort of come to understand a little bit more about the world that was being lived in back in 1931, sort of a springboard to the world's events and the sort of understanding of the different crises that were being faced some 90 years ago. If you have enjoyed what you've seen today, then please do click the little thumbs up button down below, and I would be incredibly grateful and thankful if you were to click the little subscribe button below as well. It's free. Go do it, please. If you have anything you would like to add to what I've already said, maybe expand on a few points that I might have mentioned, then please do drop a comment below. But without further ado, I'm going to wish you all well for the rest of the week, and I will see you next week. See you later.